Why would the man who tried to explain the human mind spend so much time looking back at his own childhood? Welcome. Today's episode is not about Freud, the famous theorist. It's about Freud, the human being, the child, the son, the young man trying to make sense of feelings that didn't quite make sense. Because when you look closely, the roots of Freud's ideas don't start in laboratories. They start in small, awkward, very human moments. Freud was born in 1856. His father was about 40, already a grown man with a long life behind him. His mother was much younger, energetic, warm, and completely devoted to her first child. She called him my golden Sigmund. For a child, that kind of love is powerful. It tells you that you are special, important, maybe even destined for something bigger. But that kind of attention can also create pressure. A child who grows up hearing he is extraordinary may quietly feel that he must prove it. Freud carried that sense of destiny with him. But there was another moment from childhood that stayed with him for the rest of his life. One day his father told him a story from the street. A stranger had insulted him, knocked his hat into the mud, and called him a slur. Young Freud asked what his father did. His father said calmly, "I picked up my hat and walked away." For a small boy, that answer can feel confusing. Children often imagine their fathers as protectors, strong figures who fight back. But here was a father who accepted humiliation. Years later, Freud still remembered that moment. Some historians believe it shaped his complicated feelings about authority and fatherhood. But childhood can hold even stranger memories. Freud later described an early experience that stayed in his mind. A moment when, as a very young child, he may have accidentally seen his mother naked. It's an awkward memory, the kind most people would quickly forget, but Freud didn't forget it. Instead, he turned the memory into a question. What happens inside a child's mind when they first encounter the adult world? When feelings of closeness, curiosity, and confusion mix together? That question later fed into one of Freud's most famous and controversial ideas, the Oedipus complex. The suggestion that young children sometimes experience complicated emotional attachments toward parents. Whether modern psychology fully agrees with that theory or not, what matters here is something more personal. Freud was studying experiences that had unsettled him as a child. And there was another early shock. Freud had a younger brother who died when Freud himself was still very young. Years later, he wrote about a disturbing thought that crossed his mind. The uncomfortable possibility that, somewhere deep in the unconscious, a child might feel jealousy toward a sibling. The idea that such feelings could exist, even without our awareness, fascinated him. That fascination became the seed of psychoanalysis. Freud began asking a radical question for his time. What if our minds are not completely transparent to ourselves? What if beneath our conscious thoughts there are hidden wishes, fears, and impulses we barely understand? As Freud grew older, his personality showed two sides. Emotionally intense, but also extremely disciplined. When he fell in love with Martha Bernays, the woman who would become his wife, he wrote her hundreds of letters while they were engaged. Passionate letters, jealous letters, letters that show a young man deeply attached. They eventually married and had 6 children, but something interesting happened over time. Freud's life gradually shifted toward work, toward ideas, toward the study of other people's inner worlds. Some observers later said Freud seemed more comfortable exploring emotions intellectually than living them openly. Then came one of the most dramatic relationships of his intellectual life. Carl Jung. When Freud and Jung first met, they spoke for 13 hours without stopping. Freud was fascinated. Jung was brilliant, energetic, and younger. Freud began to imagine him as the future of psychoanalysis, almost like an intellectual son. But the relationship eventually fractured. Jung wanted to explore symbolism, myth, and deeper spiritual meanings in the human psyche. Freud worried that going too far in that direction would make psychology look mystical instead of scientific. Their disagreement grew personal. Eventually, they separated. For Freud, this was painful. Losing Jung meant losing the person he once believed would continue his work. Even stranger questions appeared later in Freud's career doc. For example, telepathy. Freud never fully endorsed the idea, but he admitted that certain experiences puzzled him. Occasionally, a patient would describe a dream or image that strangely echoed something Freud himself had been thinking. Was it coincidence? Shared cultural imagery? Or some unknown mental process between two people talking deeply? Freud didn't claim to know. But he was cautious. He feared that exploring such ideas too openly might cause critics to dismiss psychoanalysis altogether. So he stayed curious, but careful. In the end, Freud's life closed in a very human way. Years of heavy cigar smoking caused a severe oral cancer. He endured decades of painful treatments and surgeries, yet continued writing and working. In 1938, he fled Vienna as Nazi forces entered Austria. A year later, suffering intensely, he asked his physician to help ease his final pain with morphine. He died in London at 83. And maybe that is the most human thing about Freud. He spent his entire life trying to understand the mind. But the questions that drove him, childhood memories, family tensions, love, jealousy, curiosity, even strange coincidences between minds, those questions were never abstract. They were personal. They came from a boy who simply could not stop wondering what was really happening inside people.